Radical feminist Valerie Solanas came out as a lesbian in the 1950s. I personally believe that her identity as a lesbian is linked and is a response to the incestuous sexual abuse trauma that she faced as a young girl within her nuclear family. I believe this not only because she was a very vocal misandrist, but also because the whole fact of being a lesbian, of lesbianism, is that there's a complete lack of men. And the impact of this incest, of rampant sexual abuse that she faced, led her to obviously and validly, respectfully so, hating men and not having that same kind of aggression and vilification of men as she did with women. Some could make the claim that Solanas did in fact prostitute herself and had sex with men. And I personally believe that if one is going to make these claims as something of a vilification of not only sex work, but of lesbians, as some people do make the claim that if you have sex with men, then you are no longer a lesbian, or you aren't, or what have you, I find that to be tremendously lesbophobic and a horrific ideal of sex work. Valerie's reasoning for prostituting herself was not only to have something of a stable income, but was also, as she said, was to mentally, quote, rewind the tape. It was a way for her to shut her brain off and was something of a response of, again, not only her sexual abuse, but also a way to compartmentalize her past, not only her trauma, but also in a way of thinking, in a way of clearing her mind and trying to find some focus in a small amount of time. She wrote the Scum Manifesto in 1967 as a critique of the patriarchal culture that she found herself and that we still find ourselves today, granted with not that same kind of aggression that was happening in the 50s and 60s, but it is still most definitely alive and well here in 2020. She asks of women to do 4 things: to overthrow the government, to eliminate the money system, to institute complete automation, and to eliminate the male sex. A lot of people currently and probably will forever know her as a misandrist and ignore the other parts of the manifesto's claims and wants that she wants women to have. And I personally believe that the last part, the elimination of male sex, is not only an intense cry of misandry, but is also a semi-legitimate response to her trauma. Of course, with everything that has happened in her life thus far, with the responses that she's had of men and their aggression towards her in such hyper patriarchal, hyper masculine society that she lived in, she is of course going to respond in such an aggressive way. Her asking for misandry, for the elimination of the male sex, is her response to her sexual trauma and is once again the very loud and abrasive personification that she is of a man-hating dyke. I would now very much like to focus on the Scum Manifesto and its intent, specifically how it was received because Valerie was so, she was tremendously intent on everything that she did in just her daily way of life, but specifically with this piece of work. With the manifesto, she was dead serious in everything about it. She very aggressively um, created herself and made herself into that much of a bubble of a legitimate, total outsider, not only within the feminist community, but with just society as a whole. Her identity as a lesbian already made her that much put away from everyone, but when she was calling for misandry, a lot of people either thought that she was crazed or mad and disavowed anything that came out of her mouth and anything that she created. And that's kind of been how she's received from then and now. I personally believe that her legitimate intent of this manifesto is not only an amazing piece of work with, yes, it's tremendously aggressive, but there's so much that can be taken out of it and toned down a bit that could be used in our current modern society and used for the better. I'm not going to name any specifics, but you know me pretty well, and I think you would know which ones that I would choose. Not misandry. Some misandry. I'm joking, but I really do want to focus on how Valerie was received with this manifesto, because this puts her so much more on the wayside of everything, and how her identity as a lesbian was molded into something that could give people a list of things to tick off, of a list of things to tick off on her as a continued way of discrediting her, and how there are just so few lesbian icons in general, but specifically in such a political aspect, mainly because such radical feminism is leading to is in her, in the way of Valerie, it is so aggressive, and so much of her is going to be discredited of is going to be discredited because she's a lesbian and because she calls for misandry, and no one else is going to take her seriously because of that. And I feel like that's just another cog in the patriarchal wheel that we live in, because even though she did consider herself a social propagandist, her identity put her that much more on the wayside. I'm speaking in circles now, but I really do want to hone in on how a lot of people do discredit her because she called for misandry, but because they add on a preconceived notion of lesbianism as being so aggressively anti-men, which is the point of being a lesbian. It's not anti-men, but it is a lack of men. The final part that I would like to talk about is the aspect of Valerie's life that a lot of people are far more familiar with her, which is her attempting to assassinate Andy Warhol. As we all know, the reasoning for it was her paranoia of him because she thought that he stole a piece of her work. Wasn't the case intentionally. He just forgot about it. Again, we all know this, and then he did end up using it. Yada yada yada. I find it very fascinating, this paranoia and also like a lack of belief of from others about this. That I really want to pinpoint on that, considering the lack of general belief that it has gone a lot better, but most definitely not. It wasn't what it was now back then in terms of paranoia, and a general lack of belief of women in certain aspects of their lives. In her case, after the fact, after she tried to assassinate him, after she shot him, it there was a mutual fear and paranoia with both of these great characters, and one still kept his flame of celebrity alive, although he did become a bit more of a recluse. And Valerie died out, as one would put it. She That was what everyone was knowing her. That was what everyone knew her of, oh, you tried to kill Andy Warhol. And it makes sense as to why people would gravitate and really hook on this part of her, of this moment in her life, because in this case specifically, it does continue to perpetuate her image and literal life of just being completely against men. And this does heavily deal with the looming and somewhat predatory nature, not really specifically with Andy, but with her general feeling of men. I think most definitely that a large part of her paranoia of him not only stealing her work, but continued to snowball into her trauma. I feel like a lot of her life is so reflective upon the trauma and the response of the trauma that she's faced in terms of her sexual abuse. And I think that is a large part of her, and I think that is something that a lot of people should be taking into account for her when talking about her. It's so horrific and incredibly depressing that such a horrible, disgusting part of her youth has shaped her into who she became. And I can only imagine how she would turn out if her life did not start up with, but not if she wasn't sexually abused. It's a fairy tale of a life. It's one where I wouldn't even be sure if she would be a lesbian, because so much of her lesbian identity and the part that she really does carry very heavily with her is her hatred for men and the general lesbianism that comes with that characteristic, which is a lack of men.